Both Roquan Smith and Robert Quinn reported to Chicago Bears training camp, but at least one of them won't be practicing.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube video, or the YouTube channel, to keep up with all of our daily in-depth video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. On the show today, the holdout, or perhaps more accurately, hold in from Roquan Smith seeking a new contract. We'll hear what General Manager Ryan Poles said about that situation and what he didn't say about that situation, and look at where this Bears defense will be for now without Roquan Smith at practice, the impact of him missing practice and what this could mean for the Bears defense, who steps up, what else they might need. Then we'll also get to Robert Quinn, the other RQ in this, back, reported to the team, reported to training camp in person. We don't know exactly what things are going to look like from here, at least at the time I'm recording this, and that's the danger of recording these podcasts, is the news moves quickly. So we'll look at what Ryan Poles said about Quinn's return, the lack of a trade request, nothing happening at this point, according to the Bears general manager, also having Al-Quadin Muhammad back at defensive end as well. So we'll kind of look at those pieces coming together and what a potential season with or without Robert Quinn could look like, and if maybe a trade could still happen later on, even without the direct request from Robert Quinn. But let's start with Roquan Smith, because we kind of knew this Robert Quinn situation is flexible and up in the air a little bit kind of throughout this offseason. But Roquan Smith has been around the whole time and has been in negotiations, we'll say, with the Chicago Bears for a new contract extension, entering the final year of his deal, and thought to be one of the long-term pieces for this Bears defense. Up to this point, the two sides haven't really been able to work out exactly what that contract would look like, but it was sort of this understanding that, okay, whether they get it done, early in May or whenever, or whether it's in July or even right up before week one, maybe even, after the season, in January or this, upcoming January, February of next year before free agency, it's always kind of felt like one way or another, Roquan Smith's contract situation will get taken care of and sort of play itself out. So it's something to keep an eye on because it's a big amount of money, but not anything to be particularly worried about. But then he comes to training camp, checks in like normal, but all the reports is that he's not planning on participating. And it's sort of a new style of holdout that's been a part of the latest NFL CBA. I'm not an expert on the CBA, but it's my understanding that essentially, he comes to training camp, is with and around the team, but just does not participate in practices. The Bears aren't saying exactly what that's going to look like, but Ryan Poles, the general manager, did address the situation a little bit, but kind of said he's not going to address it too much when he first opened up training camp yesterday on Tuesday, meeting with the media.
I want to address just the Roquan Smith situation. So my feelings for Roquan don't change at all. I love the player and the person, and that won't change. The one thing I'll ask everyone here, I know I'm going to get a lot of questions, and I get it. I'm just not going to talk about contracts and all that. So I wanted to just make sure we addressed it, though, that in terms of my feelings for him, nothing changes.
I think Poles' assurances there are legitimate and valid that, yes, I don't really think anything has changed. It doesn't sound like, negotiations have broken down or gotten tense in any way, shape, or form. It's just part of the negotiating process and practice, I guess, for Roquan in this situation to say, you know what, I'm not going to go into these training camp practices that Roquan Smith, in this scenario, don't really need. I mean, like, yes, he's learning a new defense and learning the calls, and it's not that there's no value to them, but from his perspective, he doesn't need to be practicing throughout the entire month of August to be ready for the regular season. He'll need some practices at some point, but does not need to be out there late July and early August necessarily to be ready to go at 100% come week one. So no reason for him to really risk whatever low risk it might be, but any risk is still more than zero risk of not practicing at all, of that idea of maybe he could get an injury and cost himself millions of dollars there. And still, I think under the way this new hold-in process works, he can still be like involved in meetings of sorts and, maybe some of that idea of like a mental rep in the film room and getting the sort of the work off the field that's still involved with the team. So it's not as though he's missing absolutely everything. He's essentially mainly missing the physical aspects that risk injury, but are also important as far as, getting a feel for your teammates and communicating and all that stuff on the field. The complicating factor here is whether or not Roquan Smith has an agent, which it's not currently believed that he has an agent, and so he's basically doing this more or less on his own or with, the advice of family and friends, but no one formally trained to be representing him in exchange for, a percentage of that salary. And that can be a very smart thing financially for Roquan Smith if he's able to play it correctly, and it can be difficult and troublesome if he doesn't play it correctly. But that's also where that's why it's a complicating factor here, because we don't know how good of a strategy Roquan Smith is taking, and certainly what the final contract will be the ultimate judge of how good of a strategy Roquan Smith is taking here. But it is going to impact this Bears defense as it practices and gets ready for this regular season. We'll kind of look at what practice might look like without Roquan Smith next on Locked On Bears. We've all been in a place before in our lives where maybe money's a little tight. You're feeling a little bit paycheck to paycheck. Maybe you can't quite fill up your gas tank all the way this time, but when the next paycheck comes, maybe you can be okay. But you end up sweating it out a little bit paycheck to paycheck and feeling some of that extra stress, especially if some kind of unexpected expense or something comes up. But our friends at Dave are here to help you get out of a pinch when you really need it. Dave is a banking app that can help you get $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill your tank, buy a wedding gift, or catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief they need with extra cash. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve. Member FDIC. We'll see how this Chicago Bears defense adapts to not having Roquan Smith out there, because the Bears are still working through the idea of exactly who's going to call the defense, and also specifically, I guess, where the linebackers are going to line up. Now, throughout OTAs and minicamps up to this point, Nicholas Morrow has been, the true middle linebacker, and Roquan Smith has been the weak side linebacker, the second of the two linebackers in their nickel package, and more the outside of the two linebackers there. And as a result, Nick Morrow has been doing more of some of the play calling on defense, but the Bears have been very clear the entire time that they want both players to be able to not only line up and know the responsibilities of both parts, but also have a strong enough and consistent enough understanding of the defense and the calls to be able to communicate those calls and really be the 1A and 1B option for that. Only one player gets is it a green sticker or whatever sticker they get on the helmet that gives them the radio to get the play call in from the sideline and then communicate that out. But, if one player gets hurt, for example, say Nick Morrow gets hurt or whatever, and they would want Roquan Smith to either A, move into middle linebacker, or even if he didn't move to the middle linebacker, but take over the play calling or play distributing duties for this Bears defense. That's something that you do sort of need to be out on the field to do, at least the play calling aspect of it, the play spreading out there. And that's something he will be missing from not being out there. I don't think it's going to be particularly detrimental to, his ability to eventually catch up and do those things. But, it's not going to be the difference between Bears winning and losing games necessarily, but it is something that's going to be missing out there. And obviously his vast talent is going to be missing at practice. And I wonder if it might highlight for the Bears, specifically their current lack of depth at these off-ball linebacker positions. We talked in our training camp preview podcasts about the linebacker position on how they don't really have a true third starting linebacker for their base defense, the 4-3, when you have three linebackers on the field. It's not going to be a huge role, but it's still sometimes technically considered a starting linebacker spot, and the Bears just don't have very many players right now with much defensive experience. They've got a lot of guys who have been special teamers on teams before and have found ways to contribute, and they've got a couple of undrafted rookie free agents with some things to like and some potential promise there. But right now, penciled into that third starting spot for me is Joe Thomas, who was previously a starter for the Green Bay Packers, actually, probably a good 5-6 years ago, and has kind of since then been more of a special teams guy. Started a couple games for Houston last season, started a couple games for Dallas over a couple of years, and was also with the Ravens briefly, but hasn't been a go-to starter for any team, and is not in any way, I think, guaranteed a spot on this 53-man roster. So if he's sort of, for now, your number 3 linebacker in your base defense starting lineup, I don't know if then you sort of cross-train him as, because that would be the strong side linebacker with Roquan as the weak side linebacker and then Nick Morrow as the middle linebacker when you have all three on the field. But then when you go into your nickel, the strong side linebacker is the one that leaves, and you keep your middle and your weak side, which is going to be Roquan Smith and Nick Morrow. With Roquan Smith out, do you have Joe Thomas do strong side and base and then practice the weak side in the nickel? That would seem likely at this point, but it's not exactly the same position, and you don't typically look for exactly the same skill set in there. But beyond that, you've got, Matt Adams. He was a linebacker in the Colts defense with Matt Eberflus, but was almost exclusively a special teams player. He practiced the defensive linebacker positions, but never really played many defensive snaps in football games. So he may have the skill set to do so, but just has not proven it at the NFL level to be a guy that you necessarily can rely on up to this point at that other linebacker spot. Other than that, it's like Caleb Johnson, the undrafted free agent who was here last season, or you've got Jack Sanborn as an undrafted rookie free agent from Wisconsin, who I'm a big fan of, but it's a lot to ask an undrafted rookie free agent to step into that bigger role. So I just wonder if this could prompt the Bears to look more closely at their options, maybe among free agent linebackers. Like, it's not as though Roquan Smith's holdout would be the reason to sign a free agent linebacker, because you might think that they'll sign him at some point and just quit squabbling over whatever small difference there might be and just say, do you want Roquan Smith to be your long-term option at your middle linebacker or not? And then either give him the money or don't and move on from him next year. It just seems like there shouldn't be that much relatively to get too hung up on here. But so the holdout specifically isn't the impetus to sign the player, but the holdout might make their lack of depth more visible and help emphasize, like, hey, maybe they could use another experienced player out there, because if there were to be an injury to either Morrow or Roquan Smith, do you feel comfortable making Joe Thomas or Matt Adams, who I believe was also arrested earlier this offseason, or an undrafted free agent or whoever, a starter, or a nickel player every single snap? I mean, Roquan and Nick Morrow are essentially going to play every single snap this season that they're healthy for at those linebacker spots. And I don't currently feel great about their options if either one of them were to be hurt. And I just wonder if this holdout, or I guess hold in, could highlight that a little bit more once they see these guys with the pads on and see more of those backups going against the first team and maybe having some of those deficiencies or inconsistencies highlighted more front and center because of Roquan Smith's absence. You would need the linebacker depth, whether Roquan Smith was there or not, but him not being there might make it a little bit more visible. That's where I think the holdout could play a role there. And you're also just missing some of that leadership from Roquan Smith out on the field there. He's supposed to be one of those face of the franchise type defensive leaders, and certainly he needs to get his money. And I don't criticize him at all for doing what's in his best interest to get the best financial situation he possibly can. But then without him, it's a lot of newcomers and young players who need to step into that leadership role, and there might be a little bit of a void there. And maybe it's a good opportunity for another player to step into a leadership role, but still, it's better to kind of have the leadership there than have to need it to step up from someone else. Maybe the return of Robert Quinn can provide some of that, assuming he's going to be a full participant as normal. We'll talk about the return and maybe the end of the drama for now, or the end of the questions for now with Robert Quinn, next on Locked On Bears. Football is in the air, and boy, it's good to be back. And I'll tell you what, it's been making it that much more exciting to look ahead with this upcoming season with our friends at BetOnline.net. They're the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your sports betting needs, all the sports and events at the number one online source for odds, lines, and games. They've got odds right now for this upcoming Bears season. You can vote on the over-under for win totals set at 6.5. Bears odds to make the playoffs. They also have individual player odds for their plus minuses this season on their stats, the fantasy football stats, on how these different players are going to perform. David Montgomery's rushing yards, Darnell Mooney's receiving touchdowns, Justin Fields' touchdowns, and so much more. BetOnline is the place to go for all of your sports. Major League Baseball, you've got soccer, tennis, boxing, and you can look ahead to the hockey and basketball seasons as well. You name it, BetOnline has it. So head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. All offseason, we weren't sure if Robert Quinn would return to the Chicago Bears at any point after he skipped minicamp and OTAs, the mandatory portions of those events. But training camp comes around, Robert Quinn shows up, checks in as normal, and Robert Quinn's back. The speculation all offseason has been either A, maybe the Bears were looking to move on from him, given the size of his contract and his age, where he is at this stage of his career, and then B, more strongly, the speculation rumors that were never really concretely reported were that perhaps he wanted out of Chicago and did not want to be part of this rebuild that they're not calling a rebuild in Chicago. But instead, he's here. The Bears don't really know exactly what to expect from him yet, but Ryan Poles kind of cleared the air a little bit that no trade request has been made up to this point.
Do you think Robert Quinn wants to be here, or has he expressed a desire for a trade?
I haven't had that conversation with him. I would hope that he wants to be here. So that nothing's changed on that front.
How does he fit in? You've got a roster that's dramatically younger than it was a year ago. Mm-hmm. A lot less experience. How does he fit where he's at in his career with where you guys are at, sort of constructing and putting this thing together?
Yeah, I think it's important to have guys that are experienced, that have had success in this league and know how to play and practice. So for me, that's what he brings.
So it's not a ringing endorsement or a ringing vote of confidence necessarily of like, yeah, he's here, he's going to be here, and we're glad to have him, and he's going to be around, and we want him to be here for as long as he can, blah, blah, blah. Not quite that, but at least a confirmation that up to that point, no trade request had been made. And I do think that General Manager Ryan Poles there was being particular about the language he was using and how he was wording exactly what has and has not happened with Robert Quinn specifically. But still, I think it's an important development that he did arrive and is not like specifically holding out, because we just wondered like if he had requested a trade, which had never been formally reported. And we talked about that on this podcast a couple of weeks ago when we previewed the defensive end position. That's been the peculiar thing about this. There's been all this rumors and speculation and talk and feeling that Robert Quinn wanted out of Chicago, wanted a trade, but it was never specifically concretely reported. We never got the Adam Schefter tweet or the Ian Rappaport tweet or even the Brad Biggs tweet that like Robert Quinn has requested a trade and the Bears are taking trade offers. It was always like the feeling is perhaps Robert Quinn may want out of the organization. And it just seems like in the modern day and age of football reporting, the missing gap there always was whatever the opposite of, like, sort of like the smoking gun, but it's like it's not the smoking gun of nothing actually happening. So it's sort of like the reverse of, like, that was always the clue that it was always more speculative. And I wonder if, to me, like, maybe the Bears had talks or had, listened to conversations about it, but nothing had ever matriculated. So it was never like something to formally report. But it was sort of known through murmurs that maybe it had been happening. So it was nothing that anyone could, full stop report trade had been requested. It never happened. And so it's notable that, again, Ryan Poles is saying that has not happened up to this point. Perhaps Robert Quinn could show up to training camp and go to Ryan Poles' office and say, hey, I'm here now, but I don't want to be, not going to practice. Please trade me. I mean, there's still time for something like that to happen. But assuming he's here and part of the organization, I think it's a great boost for everybody. I mean, it's going to help the offensive linemen that he practices against. They're going to have a better opponent to help really kind of train themselves, as we have new offensive tackle Riley Reif in the building. We'll have to break him down here in the coming days on the podcast. Now a more direct competition between Tevin Jenkins and Larry Borum opposite him, whatever side that's going to be. So it's good for them. It's good for the other pass rushers to really have that consistent veteran to look to. And I mean, Al-Quadin Muhammad is also back with the team after having not been there or not practiced for a lot of the offseason. He's also a veteran, but Robert Quinn's really like, that Pro Bowl, literal Pro Bowl caliber player for them to look to and learn from. And I think there's a lot of value there. And if he's a part of this team week 1 and for the regular season, of course, and it's an 18.5 sack guy or whatever his total was last season, very valuable for this Bears defense. Like, all of a sudden, you start to feel like the pieces are coming together a little bit here. You got a couple of offensive linemen. You got your pass rush back a little bit. Okay, you're piecing together not a Super Bowl team, probably not even a playoff team, but something that you can feel a little bit better about right now than you could 7 days ago, even 3 or 4 days ago. You had 2 offensive linemen and maybe get Quinn back, then that's something here that we can still feel pretty good about. And still, I don't think, even if Robert Quinn practices and is part of all of training camp in the preseason and is there week 1, I don't know that guarantees that he's there week 10. A mid-season trade could still be in the works here. You think like Devon Miller last season being traded from Denver to the Los Angeles Rams, something like that feels like still perhaps the most likely outcome, that by week 18 or whenever, by the trade deadline, but after the trade deadline, that Robert Quinn might not finish this season as a Chicago Bear. You wait for a really strong contending team to maybe have an injury with the pass rush, or maybe realize during the season that their pass rush just isn't quite as good as they would want it to be, and take advantage of a team that's maybe desperate or just trying to leverage and go all in on this season and take a nice draft pick from them for a future season to take Robert Quinn off the Bears' hands, get some salary cap relief as a result. We'll kind of see how it plays out. But for now, Robert Quinn in the building, Roquan Smith also in the building, not practicing. We'll kind of see how that plays out. You can be sure any Roquan Smith contract developments, we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and each and every day. It's tough with training camp. The news comes out quickly, and we can't always be on top of it by the time you listen to this podcast. That's why it's important to make Locked On Bears your first listen of the day, because it'll change before you know it, and we'll be breaking it all down for you the next day. So keep coming back for more, and I hope as a result that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.